Sometimes the places we're drawn to hold answers we didn't know we were searching for. Sometimes a man has to leave everything behind to find what truly matters. When Elias Boone bought a rotting cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains that no one had lived in for 20 years, the folks in Cold Creek called him a fool. They said the old place was cursed, that the miners who'd vanished from there one brutal winter had left nothing but bad memories and colder ghosts. But Boone wasn't looking for their approval. Alone in that forgotten cabin, surrounded by decay and silence, he found something the town had buried along with its past: a journal, a chest, and the truth about what really happened on that mountain. What he discovered would shake Cold Creek to its foundations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind came down from the mountains with a bite that reminded a man he was still alive, still breathing, still here when so many others weren't. Elias Boone stood outside the land office in Cold Creek, Montana Territory, with a deed clutched in his weathered hands and the weight of $200 in gold dust lighter in his pack. The transaction had taken all of 10 minutes. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose, had looked at Boone like he was signing his own death warrant. "You sure about this, mister?" The clerk had asked one last time. "That cabin's been empty since '75. There's reasons for that." Boone had simply nodded and pressed his thumb to the ink pad, leaving his mark on the document that made him owner of a piece of forsaken land that nobody else wanted. He was 57 years old, had lived through more winters than he cared to count, and had learned long ago that the things people avoided often held the most truth. Cold Creek wasn't much of a town, but it had grown in the 20 years since the mining rush had swept through these mountains. What had started as a collection of tents and rough timber structures had evolved into something more permanent. There was a main street now, lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to look more substantial than they were. The general store, the saloon, the assayer's office, a small church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, as if even it was uncertain about staying. At the end of the street stood the sheriff's office, a squat building made of local stone that looked like it had been there since the mountains themselves were born. Boone folded the deed carefully and tucked it inside his coat. Close to his chest, where the cold couldn't reach it, the paper represented more than just ownership of a rotting cabin. It represented a choice, a commitment to something he couldn't quite name yet. He'd been in Cold Creek for 2 days now, staying at Ada Morrison's boarding house while he arranged the purchase and gathered what supplies he'd need for the winter ahead. Ada was a widow herself, somewhere in her middle 50s, with silver threading through her dark hair and eyes that had seen enough of life to know when not to ask too many questions. She'd served him breakfast both mornings without comment, though he'd caught her watching him with something that might have been concern or might have been curiosity. The general store was his next stop. Samuel Hewitt ran the place, had for the better part of 15 years, according to the sign above the door. He was a compact man with a barrel chest and arms thick from hauling supplies, and he'd greeted Boone with the professional courtesy of someone who'd sell to anyone with coin. "Even a fool heard you bought the Fairweather place," Hewitt said, as Boone began selecting items from the shelves. "Flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, hardtack, the basics that would keep a man alive through a Montana winter. That what they call it?" Boone asked, running his hand over a coil of rope, testing its strength. "That's what it was. Thomas Fairweather and his crew worked a claim up there. Had themselves a good operation going, or so they thought." Hewitt leaned against the counter, his tone conversational, but his eyes measuring. 5 men went up that mountain in the fall of '75. Come spring, none of them came back down." Boone added the rope to his growing pile. "What happened to them?" Hewitt shrugged, but there was something careful in the gesture. "Avalanche, most folks figure. Or maybe they got caught in a storm, froze to death before they could make it back to town. Mountains don't give up their dead easily. Could be they're still up there, buried under 20 years of snow and stone." "Could be," Boone agreed. though something in Hewitt's voice suggested the storekeeper didn't quite believe his own words. "You got people, Boone? Family that knows where you're headed?" The question was casual, but Boone heard the real concern underneath it. He paused in his examination of a box of ammunition, 4440 cartridges, that would fit the Winchester rifle strapped to his pack outside. "Had a wife once, Martha. She passed 3 years back. Fever took her in the spring, quick and mean." Hewitt's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Appreciate that." Boone selected 2 boxes of ammunition. "No children. Just me now. That's a hard thing, being alone. Sometimes alone is what a man needs." Boone met Hewitt's eyes directly. "Sometimes it's the only way to hear yourself think." They finished the transaction in silence after that, Hewitt tallying up the supplies, while Boone counted out the payment in gold dust and coins. It came to $43, which would leave him with enough to get through the winter if he was careful and the hunting was good. As Hewitt wrapped the supplies in brown paper and twine, the door opened and a blast of cold air announced a new arrival. The man who entered wore a sheriff's star pinned to his coat and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with a strong jaw and hair gone mostly grey at the temples. His eyes swept the store and landed on Boone with an intensity that felt deliberate. "This him?" the sheriff asked Hewitt, though his gaze never left Boone. "Sheriff Tom Briggs, meet Elias Boone," Hewitt said, his voice carefully neutral. "Boone just bought the old Fairweather cabin." Briggs moved closer, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "That right? You're the one they're all talking about." "Didn't know I was worth talking about," Boone said evenly. "Man buys a death trap that's been empty for 20 years. People talk." Briggs hooked his thumbs in his gun belt. A posture that was meant to look casual, but came across as territorial. "You know what happened up there? Heard the miners disappeared, died. Same thing in the end." Briggs tilted his head slightly. "You strike me as a man with some experience in the mountains. You really think it's wise, heading up there alone with winter coming on?" Boone finished shouldering his pack, the weight of his new supplies settling familiarly across his back. "I think a man's got to make his own choices, Sheriff. Wise or otherwise." "Fair enough." Briggs stepped aside, but not quite enough to give Boone a clear path to the door. "Just want to make sure you know what you're getting into. That cabin's been sitting empty for good reason. Some places are meant to be left alone. I'll keep that in mind." As Boone moved past him, Briggs spoke again, his voice lower. "One more thing. If you find anything up there, anything that belonged to those miners, it's the property of their families." "Law's clear on that." Boone turned back, studying the sheriff's face. There was something in Briggs' expression, something that didn't quite match the helpful concern in his words. "Didn't plan on finding anything but a roof and 4 walls, Sheriff." "Good, that's good." Briggs nodded slowly. "You need help, you send word. Town looks after its own, even the stubborn ones." Outside, the afternoon sun was already sinking toward the western peaks, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of orange and gold. Boone took a moment to breathe in the cold air, letting it fill his lungs and clear his head. He'd spent the last 3 years drifting, trapping in the high country during winter and hiring himself out as a guide or hunter during the warmer months. After Martha died, staying in one place had felt like drowning. But the drifting hadn't healed anything either. It had just kept him moving, kept him from having to face the empty space where his life used to be. Maybe that's what had drawn him to the cabin when he'd heard about it. A place nobody wanted, a place with its own ghosts. A place where a man could stop running and finally face whatever he'd been avoiding. Ada Morrison was waiting on the porch of her boarding house when he returned. She had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders and a cup of coffee steaming in her hands. "Got your supplies?" she asked. "All set. Tom Briggs talk to you?" "He did." She nodded, as if she'd expected as much. "Tom's a good sheriff, keeps the peace. But he's got his ways of seeing things. Don't always leave room for someone else's view. Seemed concerned about my well-being." "Maybe so." Ada sipped her coffee, her eyes distant. "I knew those miners, you know. The ones who disappeared. Thomas Fairweather used to come into town every few weeks for supplies. Good man, quiet but good. Had a daughter back east he was planning to send for once he struck it rich. What happened to her?" Don't know. Lost track after the men vanished. The families came looking, asked questions, but there were no answers to give them. Eventually they stopped coming. She turned to face him fully. 20 years is a long time, Mr. Boone. Long enough for people to forget, or to decide they want to forget. You think there's something worth remembering? Ada was quiet for a moment, then she smiled sadly. I think there's always something worth remembering, even if it hurts. Maybe especially if it hurts. Boone left before dawn the next morning, while the stars were still bright overhead and the town was still sleeping. He strapped on his snowshoes and adjusted his pack one final time, checking that the deed was secure in his inside coat pocket. The paper felt solid against his chest, a reminder of the decision he'd made. Then he turned his face toward the mountains and began to walk. The cabin was 5 miles up, following an old mining trail that would be buried under snow in places, but still navigable if a man was careful. As the first light began to break over the eastern horizon, Elias Boone thought about the deed in his coat, about Martha's grave back in a town whose name he barely remembered anymore, about Thomas Fairweather and his daughter who never got to join him. He thought about all the ways a man could disappear and all the ways he could be found. The deed represented his commitment to this place, to whatever truth it held. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered if Sheriff Briggs' warning had been concern or something else entirely. The trail up the mountain tested every bit of Boone's experience. Snow had drifted deep in places, forcing him to break trail with his snowshoes, each step requiring deliberate effort. The trees grew thicker as he climbed, lodgepole pines and Douglas fir standing like silent witnesses to his passage. Occasionally he'd stop to catch his breath, turning to look back down at Cold Creek below. The town, growing smaller with each 100 yards of elevation gained. It took him 4 hours to reach the cabin. He smelled it before he saw it, that particular scent of old wood and decay, of a structure slowly surrendering to the elements. Then the trees opened up, and there it was, sitting in a small clearing with the mountain rising steeply behind it. The cabin was smaller than he'd imagined, maybe 20 feet on a side, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to a silvery grey. The roof sagged in the middle, and one of the front windows had lost its covering entirely, leaving a dark square that looked like a missing tooth. Boone approached slowly, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his shoulder. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed except for animal tracks, deer, rabbit, maybe a fox. No human had been here in a very long time. The door hung crooked on leather hinges that had dried and cracked. It took some effort to push it open, the bottom scraping across the floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the mountain silence. Boone stepped inside and let his eyes adjust to the dimness. The interior was a single large room with a stone fireplace taking up most of the back wall. To the left, a doorway led to what must have been a smaller back room. The floor was rough planking, covered in years of dust and debris that had blown in through the broken window. There was a table, overturned, and the remnants of what had been chairs, now just broken pieces of wood scattered across the floor. A few shelves still clung to the walls, empty except for mouse droppings and the husks of dead insects. But it was the feeling of the place that struck him most. Not the decay or abandonment, he'd expected that. It was something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The cabin felt interrupted, like whoever had lived here had left in the middle of something and never came back. Boone set down his pack and began a methodical examination. The fireplace first. He'd need that working if he was going to survive up here. The chimney seemed sound enough, though it would need cleaning. He tested the floorboards, finding them mostly solid despite their age, though a few near the walls had started to rot. The back room was even smaller than he'd thought, just large enough for a narrow bed and maybe a trunk. It too had been stripped bare. He was checking the stability of the walls when his boot caught on something. Looking down, he saw that one of the floorboards near the fireplace sat slightly higher than the others. Curious, he knelt and worked his knife blade into the gap, prying gently. The board came up easier than it should have, revealing a space beneath. Inside that space, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it remarkably preserved, was a leather journal. Boone lifted it out carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The leather was water-stained and had darkened with age, but the binding was still intact. He carried it to the broken window where the light was better and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was precise, the kind learned in good schools back east. At the top of the first page, in slightly faded ink, were the words, "Journal of Thomas Fairweather, September 1875." Boone felt something shift in his chest. This was the lead miner, the man Ada Morrison had spoken of, the man who'd never made it back to his daughter. He read the first entry slowly, arrived at the claim today with the crew. "The cabin is rougher than we'd hoped, but it will serve. John McAllister, we call him Red for his hair, is optimistic about the site. Samuel Chen, who has more experience with gold than any of us, agrees this is promising ground. Victor Hartwell is young but strong, willing to learn. And then there is the fifth man, who arrived this morning from back east. He says his name is T. Briggs, and he claims to have knowledge of mining operations. There is something about him I cannot quite place, a sharpness in his eyes that makes me uneasy. But we need the extra hands, and he has put up his share of the stake." Boone's fingers tightened on the journal. T. Briggs. Could it be? But no, Briggs was a common enough name. And 20 years ago, Sheriff Tom Briggs would have been just a young man. Still, something about the coincidence troubled him. He flipped forward through the pages, scanning the entries. They documented the daily work of the claim, digging, hauling ore, the back-breaking labor of men who believed they were close to something big. Then about 3 weeks in, the tone shifted. "October 14th, we found it today. God help us, we found it. A vein of gold, so pure, so rich, that I can scarcely believe my own eyes. Samuel Chen estimates it could yield $50,000, perhaps more. We have agreed to tell no one outside our group until we can properly stake and register the claim. Victor suggested we bring in the assayer quietly, without fanfare. T. Briggs agreed, though I noticed he was quick to volunteer for the trip to town. Something in his eagerness troubles me. The entries grew shorter after that, more cryptic. References to the find without details. Mentions of disagreements about how to divide the gold, about whether to expand the operation or keep it small. And running through it all, a growing unease about T. Briggs. October 28th, Briggs returned from town today. He says he spoke to no one about the gold, but I saw him with the assayer through the window. He claims they were discussing another matter. I want to believe him. We are all tired, all stretched thin by the work and the cold. Perhaps I am seeing shadows where there are none. November 3rd, the tension in the camp is unbearable. Briggs and Red had words today about the division of shares. Briggs believes he should receive a larger portion because of his expertise. Red told him exactly what he could do with his expertise. Victor had to step between them. I fear this will not end well. November 12th. Someone has been in my things. I keep the claim papers and the assayer's preliminary report hidden in this journal. This morning I found them disturbed, as if someone had been looking through them. When I confronted the others, Briggs became defensive, almost angry. He asked why I don't trust my own partners. But it is not a matter of trust. It is a matter of security. This gold could make us all wealthy, or it could destroy us. The entries grew more sporadic. November passed into December, and the tone became increasingly paranoid. Fairweather wrote of strange sounds in the night, of feeling watched, of supplies going missing. Then came an entry that made Boone's blood run cold. December 15th. I know now that T. Briggs is not who he claims to be. I found a letter in his things. I am not proud of searching, but my suspicions demanded it. The letter was from someone in Cold Creek, someone with authority. It referenced keeping an eye on the operation and ensuring proper documentation. I believe Briggs has been reporting on us from the beginning. But to whom? And for what purpose? When I confronted him, he denied everything, said I was losing my mind from isolation. The others are beginning to believe him. Even Samuel seems uncertain of me now. I must be careful. I must protect what we have found. Boone turned the page and found the last entry, dated February 12th, 1875. The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic. "He knows that I know. I saw it in his eyes tonight at supper. The others have gone to check the mine. Briggs said he heard something, maybe a cave-in. I did not go. I stayed here with my rifle across my knees and this journal in my lap. If something happens to me, if anyone finds this, know that T. Briggs is—" The entry ended there, the sentence incomplete, the ink trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted. Boone turned the page, but the rest of the journal was blank. He sat there in the failing light, the journal heavy in his hands, and listened to the silence of the cabin. Thomas Fairweather had sat in this very spot, perhaps in this exact place, writing those final words. And then something had happened, something that had left 5 men dead, and this cabin empty for 20 years. Boone looked around the room with new eyes. This wasn't just an abandoned cabin. It was a crime scene. And somewhere in these walls, in this mountain, lay the truth of what had happened that winter night. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the broken window and sending a scatter of snow across the floor. Night was coming, and with it the cold. Boone needed to get a fire going, needed to secure the cabin against the weather. But first, he carefully rewrapped the journal in its oilcloth and tucked it inside his coat, close to where he kept the deed. Some things were too important to leave lying around. As he began gathering wood for a fire, Elias Boone made a decision. He'd come up here looking for solitude, for a place to escape his grief and his memories. But he'd found something else instead. He'd found a mystery, and 5 men who'd never gotten justice, and a daughter who'd never known what happened to her father. Maybe this was why he'd been drawn to this place. Maybe this was the purpose he'd been searching for, without knowing it. He would find out what happened to Thomas Fairweather and his crew. And if T. Briggs was who Boone suspected he might be, then Cold Creek was about to learn that some secrets don't stay buried forever. Morning came cold and clear, the kind of mountain dawn that made everything look sharp-edged and new. Boone had spent a restless night, the journal's final entry replaying in his mind every time he closed his eyes. He'd managed to get the fireplace working, and the cabin had warmed enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay. But comfort had little to do with sleep when a man's thoughts were churning. He ate a sparse breakfast of hardtack and coffee, then began a systematic search of the cabin with the morning light to guide him. If Fairweather had hidden his journal under the floorboards, there might be other things concealed in this place. The miners had lived here for months. They would have stashed their valuables, their important documents, anywhere they thought would be safe from thieves or the elements. The main room yielded little at first. He checked every floorboard, tapping and listening for hollow sounds. He examined the fireplace stones, looking for any that might be loose or deliberately placed to hide a cavity. The shelves, the walls, even the spaces between the logs, nothing. It was in the back room that he found it. The space was barely 8 feet square, with a single small window that looked out onto the steep slope behind the cabin. The floor here was in worse condition, with several boards warped from water damage where the roof had leaked. Boone knelt and began working his way across the room, testing each board. In the far corner, beneath where a bed would have stood, he found what he was looking for. 3 boards came up together, revealing a deeper cavity than the one that had held the journal. And there, wrapped in canvas that had gone stiff with age and damp, was an iron lockbox. It took him 20 minutes to pry the rusted lock open with his knife and a stone from the fireplace. When the lid finally gave way with a screech of protesting metal, Boone found himself looking at the accumulated evidence of Thomas Fairweather's gold strike. The first thing he pulled out was a leather portfolio tied with string. Inside were papers, official-looking documents with stamps and seals. He spread them out carefully on the floor, his hands surprisingly steady despite the racing of his heart. An assayer's report, dated October 20th, 1875, and signed by Marcus Whitmore of Cold Creek. The report detailed the analysis of ore samples from the Fairweather claim, with estimates of gold content that made Boone's breath catch. 93% pure, in a vein estimated at 40 feet long and 3 feet wide. At current prices, the report concluded, the claim could yield upwards of $75,000. A fortune. More money than most men would see in 3 lifetimes. Beneath the assayer's report were crude maps, hand-drawn but detailed. They showed the cabin's location and marked with an X and the words Devil's Throat, a spot about a quarter-mile up the mountain. Notes in the margins indicated depth, the angle of the vein, places where the rock was most stable for digging. Someone, probably Samuel Chen, based on the journal entries, had known what they were doing, but it was the last item in the portfolio that made everything click into place. A claim registration form, partially filled out but never submitted. The names of all 5 miners were listed: Thomas Fairweather, John McAllister, Samuel Chen, Victor Hartwell, and the last name had been scratched out so thoroughly that it was illegible. But Boone didn't need to read it. He knew what it had said: T. Briggs. At the bottom of the lockbox, wrapped separately in oilcloth, was a leather pouch. Boone opened it and poured the contents into his palm. Gold nuggets, maybe a dozen of them, each one the size of a bean. But these weren't ordinary nuggets. Someone had carved strange symbols into each one, marks that looked almost like letters but weren't quite. Some kind of code, maybe, or a way to identify them. Boone sat back on his heels, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. The miners had found gold, a lot of it. They'd had it assayed, started mapping the vein, preparing to register their claim officially. But something had gone wrong. Someone T. Briggs had decided he didn't want to share. And somehow he'd managed to make sure he wouldn't have to. The question was, what had happened to the gold? If Briggs had killed the others and taken it, why leave these nuggets behind? Why leave the assayer's report and the maps? Unless he hadn't known they were here. Unless Fairweather had hidden everything before. Boone's thoughts were interrupted by a sound outside. Bootsteps in snow coming closer. He moved quickly, scooping everything back into the lockbox and shoving it under the floorboards. The boards went back into place just as a voice called out from the front of the cabin. "Boone? You in there?" It was Samuel Hewitt from the general store. Boone stood and walked to the main room, finding the storekeeper standing in the doorway, stamping snow from his boots. "Morning," Boone said carefully. "Didn't expect company." Hewitt smiled, but there was something uneasy in his expression. "Thought I'd check on you, make sure you made it up here all right." "It's a hard climb in winter. Made it fine. Coffee's still hot if you want some. Don't mind if I do." Hewitt came inside, his eyes sweeping the cabin. "Got the place warmed up, I see." "That's good. That's real good." Boone poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it over. "Long way to come just to check on a stranger." "Maybe." Hewitt sipped the coffee, then met Boone's eyes directly. "Maybe I wanted to talk to you away from town." "Away from folks who might be listening?" "About what?" "About why you really bought this place." Hewitt set down his cup. "I've run that store for 15 years, Boone. In that time, I've seen maybe a dozen people ask about the Fairweather cabin. None of them went through with buying it. You did. That tells me something." "Tells you what?" "That you're either braver or more foolish than most. Or maybe that you know something the others didn't." Hewitt glanced around the cabin again. "You find anything interesting up here?" Boone kept his face neutral. "Like what?" "Like answers. Like explanations for what happened to 5 good men." Hewitt's voice dropped lower. "I knew them, Boone, all of them. Thomas Fairweather used to play chess with me on Sunday afternoons. Red McAllister helped me build the addition on the store. Samuel Chen taught my boy how to read Chinese characters. These weren't strangers. They were friends. What do you think happened to them?" Hewitt was quiet for a long moment. "I think someone killed them. I've thought that for 20 years, but I could never prove it. The families came looking, hired investigators, offered rewards. Nothing. It was like those 5 men just vanished into thin air. But men don't vanish, do they? Especially not when there's gold involved." "The journal mentioned gold," Boone said carefully. "A big strike. Did it now?" Hewitt's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "And did it mention who might have wanted that gold bad enough to kill for it?" "It mentioned someone named T. Briggs." The silence that followed was heavy. Hewitt picked up his coffee cup again, but his hand wasn't quite steady. Tom Briggs came to Cold Creek in the fall of 1875, said he was from back east, looking for opportunity in the territories. He worked odd jobs for a few months, then went up the mountain to join the Fairweather crew. When he came back down in the spring, alone, he had a story about getting separated in a storm. Said he looked for the others, but never found them. Most folks believed him. He seemed torn up about it, and there wasn't any reason to doubt him. But you doubted him. I didn't at first. But then, over the next few years, Tom Briggs went from being a broke drifter to one of the wealthiest men in the territory. He bought land, invested in businesses, eventually became sheriff. When people asked where the money came from, he said he'd struck it rich on a claim down in Nevada before coming here. Had papers to prove it, all legal and proper. Papers can be forged. That they can. Hewitt finished his coffee. I tried to investigate once, about 10 years back. Sent letters to Nevada, tried to verify his story. What I found was that there had been a J.B. Hartwell who'd filed a claim there, but no Tom Briggs. Funny thing about that name, though. Victor Hartwell, one of the miners who died, his middle name was Joshua. And Briggs's middle name is Briggs. It's his mother's maiden name. Boone felt the pieces shifting again. Joshua Briggs Hartwell, J.B. Hartwell. Now you're following me. I think Tom Briggs stole his partner's identity to file that claim. Used Victor's name and his own to create someone who never existed. Then he came back here, changed his story to say the gold came from Nevada instead of Montana, and lived off blood money for 20 years. Why are you telling me this? Hewitt moved toward the door, then stopped. Because you're the first person who's asked the right questions in 2 decades. Because those 5 men deserve justice, and their families deserve the truth. And because Tom Briggs has been sheriff long enough. He's got power in this town, Boone. He's got friends and influence and people who owe him. If you're going to go after him, you need to know what you're up against. And if I'm not going after him, Hewitt smiled sadly, then you wouldn't have hidden that lockbox so fast when you heard me coming. After Hewitt left, Boone stood at the window and watched the storekeeper's figure disappear down the trail. The man had taken a risk coming up here, telling him what he knew. That meant something. It meant Boone wasn't alone in this, even if he was the one who'd have to do the heavy lifting. He pulled the lockbox out again and studied its contents in the full light of day. The assayer's report, the maps, the marked nuggets, all of it was evidence. But evidence of what exactly? A gold strike, yes, but not murder, not theft. For that, he'd need more. He'd need to find the mine itself. He'd need to see what Devil's Throat could tell him about that winter 20 years ago. 3 days after Hewitt's visit, a storm rolled in from the north. Boone watched it come, dark clouds piling up against the peaks like a wall of slate. By afternoon, snow was falling so thick he could barely see the trees at the edge of the clearing. The wind howled around the cabin, finding every crack and gap in the walls, and even with the fire blazing, the cold crept in like something alive. He used the time to make repairs. The cabin needed work if he was going to survive the winter here, and keeping busy helped quiet the thoughts that kept circling back to the journal, the lockbox, and the man who'd killed for gold. He patched the broken window with oilcloth stretched over a crude frame. He reinforced the door hinges with strips of leather from his pack. He cleared the chimney of 20 years of accumulated nests and debris. It was while working on a leak in the roof that he found it. The leak was above the back room, where water had been seeping through and rotting the floorboards. Boone climbed up into the small attic space, barely more than a crawl space between the ceiling and the roof peak, with a lantern in one hand and his knife in the other. The leak itself was easy enough to find, a gap where the roofing boards had separated, but as he moved to patch it, his lantern light caught something that didn't belong, a false ceiling board set apart from the others. Someone had created a small hiding space in the roof itself. Boone worked the board free carefully, mindful of the nails that held it. Behind it, wrapped in canvas and wedged tightly to keep it from shifting, was a brass surveyor's transit. He carried it down to the main room and set it on the table, brushing away the dust and cobwebs. The instrument was beautiful, all polished brass and careful calibration, the kind of equipment that would have cost more than most miners earned in a season. This wasn't a tool you bought on a whim. This was professional-grade equipment meant for serious surveying work. Boone examined it closely in the firelight. There were no maker's marks visible, but the quality of the craftsmanship was evident. Someone had used this to map the claim, to calculate angles and distances with precision. The maps in the lockbox suddenly made more sense. They weren't the rough sketches of amateurs. They were professional survey work, but why hide it in the roof? Unless whoever owned it didn't want anyone to know they had it. Unless it was evidence of premeditation, of planning that went beyond what 5 equal partners would need. You brought a surveyor's transit when you intended to stake claims, file papers, divide territory. You brought it when you were planning something big, or when you were planning to take everything for yourself. Boone opened the journal again, reading through it with new understanding. There, in an entry from late October, Briggs has been spending time up at the claim alone, says he's checking the stability of the tunnel. But I saw him yesterday through my field glass, and he wasn't in the tunnel. He was on the ridge above it, doing something with equipment I didn't recognize. When I asked him about it, he said he was just surveying the general area, getting a sense of the land. But why? We already know where the vein runs. Fairweather had seen Briggs using the transit, had seen him surveying not just the claim itself, but the surrounding territory, planning, perhaps, how to expand the operation once he controlled it all, or planning how to file the claim under a false name, with coordinates that would lead back to him and him alone. The storm continued through the night and into the next day. Boone spent the time going through everything again, the journal, the lockbox contents, the transit. He made notes on scraps of paper, trying to piece together a timeline. September, the miners arrive, begin work. October, they find the gold vein, bring in the assayer. November, tensions rise as Briggs pushes for a larger share. December, Fairweather discovers Briggs has been lying about his identity. February, the final entry, and then silence. What had happened in those 3 months between December and February? The journal entries had grown sporadic, but Fairweather had been alive, still suspicious, still watching. And Briggs had been planning, using the transit to survey not just the claim, but the surrounding area, preparing to take it all. On the 3rd day, the storm broke. Boone woke to silence, and the pale light of dawn filtering through the patched window. Outside, the world was buried in fresh snow, everything clean and white and new. The kind of morning that made a man forget there was darkness in the world. But Boone hadn't forgotten. He strapped on his snowshoes, loaded his rifle, and tucked the maps from the lockbox inside his coat. It was time to find Devil's Throat. The climb took most of the morning. The snow was deep in places up to his waist, and the maps only gave general directions. But Boone was a tracker, had spent decades reading landscapes, and the terrain told its own story. There, a depression in the hillside that might be a trail. There, a line of stunted trees that suggested different soil underneath. The kind of mineral-rich soil you'd find near a mining operation. He found the entrance just before noon. It was smaller than he'd expected. Just a dark opening in the rock face, partially hidden by an overhang and nearly invisible under the accumulated snow. Someone had tried to conceal it further with brush and stones, but 20 years of weather had undone most of that work. Boone brushed away the snow and peered inside. The tunnel ran back into darkness, shored up with timber supports that looked sound despite their age. The air that breathed out from the entrance was cold but dry, without the damp smell of water seepage. A good mine, professionally dug, meant to last. Boone lit a lantern and stepped inside, his rifle in his other hand. The tunnel was tall enough to stand in, wide enough for 2 men to work side by side. Tool marks on the walls showed where the miners had followed the vein, chipping away at the rock, extracting the gold-bearing ore. He could see where the vein ran, a darker streak in the stone that glittered faintly in the lantern light. 30 feet in, he found the first body, not a skeleton. The cold had preserved the remains too well for that. A man, frozen in time, half buried under a pile of rock and timber. The cave-in Briggs had warned about in that final journal entry. Except this wasn't a natural collapse. The support timbers had been deliberately cut, weakened so they'd fail under the weight of the mountain. Boone moved deeper, his heart heavy with what he knew he'd find. 20 feet further, 3 more bodies, huddled together as if they'd been trying to dig their way out. And near the entrance, positioned as if he'd been standing guard, the 5th man, Thomas Fairweather, his frozen hands still clutching a rifle, his eyes open and staring at nothing. They'd been murdered here, trapped and left to die in the darkness while Briggs walked away with their gold. And for 20 years, the mountain had kept their secret. Boone stood in the mine for a long time, the lantern casting shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts. He should leave, should get out of this tomb and back to the cabin. But his feet wouldn't move. These men deserved better than to be walked away from again. He set the lantern down carefully and approached Thomas Fairweather's body. The cold had preserved him remarkably well, his features still recognizable from Ada Morrison's descriptions. A man in his late 30s, with a strong jaw and thoughtful eyes. A man who'd had a daughter waiting for him, who'd never known what happened to her father. Boone knelt beside him, meaning to close those eyes that had stared into darkness for 20 years. As he reached out, something caught the lantern light near Fairweather's hand. Something small and metallic, half buried in the frozen earth. A pocket watch. Boone picked it up carefully, brushing away the frost. The case was dented, the crystal cracked, but he could make out an engraving on the back. To my son, Victor, with pride, Father. The hands were frozen at 2:47, Victor Hartwell's watch. The young man Hewitt had described as strong and willing to learn. The man whose identity Briggs had stolen to claim the gold. Boone turned the watch over in his hands, thinking about what it meant. Victor had been here when the mine collapsed. The watch had stopped at 2:47, probably when it had been damaged in the cave-in. That gave him the approximate time of the murders, late afternoon, when the light would have been fading, when Briggs could have made his way back to town under cover of darkness. He slipped the watch into his pocket. Evidence, proof of who had been here, proof of when they died. One more piece of the puzzle. Boone spent another hour in the mine, examining everything he could in the limited light. The deliberately cut support beams, the way the bodies were positioned. The 3 men together had been deeper in the tunnel, working the vein, while Fairweather had been near the entrance. Maybe he'd heard something, grabbed his rifle, rushed to investigate. Maybe he'd realized too late what Briggs had done, and somewhere in those final moments he'd dropped his journal entry incomplete, knowing he was about to die but hoping someone would find it, would understand what had happened here. The journey back to the cabin was harder than the climb up. Boone's legs felt heavy, his thoughts heavier. He'd found what he was looking for, but the reality of it, the cold bodies, the deliberate murder, the 20 years of lies sat like a stone in his chest. At the cabin, he built up the fire and made coffee, needing the warmth and the routine to chase away the chill that had settled into his bones. Then he sat at the table and laid out everything he'd found, the journal, the lockbox contents, the surveyor's transit, and now the pocket watch. It was a complete picture now. Briggs had joined the mining crew with a plan. He'd brought professional surveying equipment, had been in contact with someone back in town who had authority, probably someone at the land office who could help him file fraudulent claims. When the miners found gold, he'd seen his opportunity. He'd used the transit to survey not just the claim, but a much larger area, preparing to stake it all for himself. He'd stolen Victor Hartwell's identity to create the fictional J.B. Hartwell. And then, one afternoon in February, he'd weakened the support beams in the mine and trapped 4 men inside. Fairweather he'd killed separately, probably shot him when the miner realized what was happening. Then Briggs had walked back to town with a story about a storm and getting separated. He'd waited a few weeks, filed the claim under his false name in Nevada, and slowly built his fortune. A fortune that became the foundation of Cold Creek's prosperity. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. Boone stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains. He could take what he'd found to the territorial marshal, try to bring formal charges. But Briggs was powerful now, had been sheriff for years. He'd have allies, people who owed him, people who wouldn't want to believe that the man who'd helped build their town was a murderer. It would be Boone's word against a respected lawman's, and even with the evidence, it might not be enough. Or he could take it to the town directly. Show them what their sheriff really was, force them to confront the truth. That might work, but it would also put him in danger. If Briggs thought his secret was about to be exposed, he might do anything to protect it. The sound of horses interrupted his thoughts. Boone moved away from the window and picked up his rifle. 2 riders, coming up the trail at a steady pace. He watched them approach, recognizing one of them immediately, Sheriff Tom Briggs, sitting tall in his saddle. The other man wore a deputy's badge and looked young, maybe 25, with the nervous energy of someone who wasn't sure what he'd gotten himself into. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. Briggs dismounted with the ease of a man comfortable on horseback, while the deputy stayed mounted, his hand resting near his sidearm. "Boone," Briggs called out. "Got a minute?" Boone set his rifle by the door, but kept it close. He stepped outside, the cold air hitting him like a slap. "Sheriff, didn't expect a visit. Just checking on you. Man alone up here. I like to make sure he's doing all right." Briggs smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You settling in okay?" "Well enough. Good. Good." Briggs glanced at the cabin, at the repaired window and the smoke rising from the chimney. "Looks like you've been fixing the place up. That's good to see. The Fairweather cabin deserves someone taking care of it. You knew them well?" "The miners." Something flickered across Briggs' face, too quick to read. "Not as well as I'd have liked. They were good men, from what I hear. Tragic what happened to them. What do you think did happen?" "Storm, most likely. Or maybe they pushed too deep into the mine and it collapsed. We'll never know for sure." Briggs stepped closer, his boots crunching in the snow. "But that's ancient history now. No point dwelling on it. Sometimes the past deserves to be dwelt on," Boone said quietly. "Sometimes it deserves to be remembered." Briggs stopped moving. The smile faded from his face, replaced by something harder. "You find something up here, Boone? Something you want to tell me about?" "Just an old cabin and a lot of silence. That right?" Briggs looked past him, trying to see into the cabin. "Because I've been hearing things. Folks say you've been asking questions about those miners, about what happened to them. About me. People talk. Yes, they do. And sometimes they talk about things they don't understand. Things that are better left alone." Briggs's voice dropped lower, taking on an edge. "I want to be clear with you, Boone. I'm trying to be neighborly here. Man to man. That cabin, this mountain, there's nothing here but old ghosts and bad memories. You'd be smart to pack up and head back down to town before winter really sets in. And if I don't, then you might end up like those miners, alone on a mountain, with nobody knowing or caring what happened to you." Briggs let the threat hang in the air between them. "I'd hate for that to happen. I really would." The deputy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, and Boone realized the young man had no idea what this was really about. He was just following orders, not understanding that his boss was threatening to murder someone. "I'll keep that in mind," Boone said. Briggs stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You do that." "Come on, deputy. We've got other rounds to make." They rode away, but Boone noticed that Briggs kept looking back, his expression unreadable. The threat had been clear enough, though. Stop digging or end up dead like the others. Boone went back inside and barred the door. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from anger. Briggs had just confirmed everything. An innocent man wouldn't have made threats. An innocent man wouldn't have warned him to leave the past alone. The sheriff knew that Boone was getting close to the truth. And now Boone knew something else. He was running out of time. If he was going to bring Briggs to justice, he'd have to move fast. Before the sheriff decided that one more body on the mountain was an acceptable price to pay for keeping his secret. That night, Boone went through the journal one more time, reading every page carefully by lamplight. He'd been so focused on the later entries, on the growing paranoia and the final words, that he'd skimmed some of the earlier passages. Now he read them all, looking for anything he might have missed. On page 17, tucked into the spine so tightly he'd missed it before, he found it, A daguerreotype photograph. The image had faded with time. The silver coating tarnished in places, but the faces were still clear. 5 men standing in front of the cabin, squinting slightly in what must have been bright sunlight. They looked confident, proud, like men who believed they were about to strike it rich. Which Boone supposed they had been. He carried the photograph to the lamp and examined it closely. 4 of the men he could identify from the journal's descriptions. Thomas Fairweather in the center, tall and serious. Red McAllister to his left, with the reddish beard that had given him his nickname. Samuel Chen on the right, shorter than the others, with intelligent eyes. Victor Hartwell beside him, young and strong-jawed, with an easy smile. And the 5th man, standing slightly apart from the others, was unmistakably a younger version of Sheriff Tom Briggs. Boone turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written the names Thomas Fairweather, John McAllister, Samuel Chen, Victor Hartwell, and then a 5th name that had been scratched out so violently the paper had nearly torn through. But holding it up to the light, tilting it at different angles, Boone could just make out the ghost of the letters underneath. T. Briggs. Someone, probably Fairweather in those final days when he'd realized what Briggs was, had tried to erase the man from the record, as if scratching out his name could undo what was coming. Boone tucked the photograph into his coat pocket alongside Victor's watch. More evidence, more proof. But would it be enough? The photograph showed that Briggs had been there, yes, but that was already part of his story. He'd never denied being with the miners. His tale of getting separated in a storm would still hold up, at least to anyone who wanted to believe it. No. What Boone needed was something that directly contradicted Briggs's story. Something that proved he'd lied about what happened that February. He spent a restless night, dozing fitfully, waking at every sound. The wind rattled the windows, and once he thought he heard footsteps outside, but when he looked, there was nothing but shadows and snow. Still, he kept his rifle close and the door barred. Briggs had made his threat clear. The sheriff would be watching now, waiting for a chance to silence him permanently. Dawn came grey and cold. Boone ate a quick breakfast, then made a decision. He needed allies, and he needed them now. Samuel Hewitt had already shown he suspected the truth. Ada Morrison had known the miners, had cared about them. If he was going to expose Briggs, he'd need help from people the town trusted. The trip down to Cold Creek took 3 hours. The trail easier now that he'd broken it multiple times. Boone kept alert, watching for any sign that he was being followed, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched never quite left him. He found Ada first at her boarding house. She was sweeping the porch when he arrived, and her face showed surprise and concern. "Mr. Boone, I didn't expect to see you back so soon. Need to talk to you. And Samuel Hewitt, if you can get word to him." Something in his tone made her set down the broom immediately. "Come inside." In her kitchen, with coffee steaming between them, Boone laid out what he'd found. The journal, the lockbox, the bodies in the mine. He showed her the photograph, watched her face tighten as she recognized the young man who would become their sheriff. "Dear God," she whispered. "All this time, all these years, I need help," Boone said quietly. "Briggs came up to the cabin yesterday. Made it clear that I should stop asking questions. If I'm going to bring this to light, I can't do it alone." Ada was quiet for a moment, then she nodded. "I'll get Samuel. But Boone, you need to understand what you're up against. Tom Briggs built half this town. The church, the school, the new bank, all funded with his money. People owe him. They trust him. You tell them he's a murderer, most of them won't want to believe it. I know. But those men deserve justice. Their families deserve to know the truth." "They do," Ada agreed. "Give me an hour. I'll have Samuel here." While he waited, Boone sat in Ada's parlor and tried to plan his next moves. Going to the territorial marshal was still an option, but that would take time. Time he might not have. And there was no guarantee the marshal would believe him over Briggs. No, he needed to expose the truth here, in Cold Creek, where people had known the victims. Where the weight of 20 years of lies might finally break under the truth. Samuel Hewitt arrived, looking worried. Ada said you needed to talk. Said it was urgent. Boone showed him everything. The storekeeper's face grew progressively graver as he examined each piece of evidence, but when he saw the photograph, he actually flinched. "I knew it," Hewitt said softly. "I always knew, but I could never prove it. Can you help me?" Boone asked. "What do you need?" "Information. Old records, anything that might show discrepancies in Briggs' story. And people, folks who might remember details from back then, who might be willing to speak up if they knew the truth." Hewitt nodded slowly. "There's the land office records. And Marcus Whitmore, the assayer, he's still alive, living over in Helena now. If he examined that ore back in 75, he might remember something." "There's something else," Ada said quietly. "The old telegraph operator, Bill Crenshaw, he kept copies of all the messages that went through his office. Packrat, that man. Never threw anything away. When he died 5 years back, his daughter boxed everything up and stored it in the church basement. If Briggs sent any telegrams back then, claiming that strike in Nevada, there might be a record." Boone felt something like hope stirring in his chest. "Can you get access to those records?" "I sit on the church board," Ada said. "I can get in. Then we have our work cut out for us." Boone looked at both of them seriously. "But I want to be clear, this is dangerous. Briggs has already threatened me. If he knows you're helping me, he might come after you too." "He's been sheriff long enough," Hewitt said firmly. "Those men were my friends. I won't stand by any more." Ada's expression was equally resolute. "Thomas Fairweather had a daughter. Somewhere out there, she spent 20 years not knowing what happened to her father. If we can give her that answer, then whatever risk we're taking is worth it." Boone looked at these two people, both old enough to remember when life was harder but also simpler. When right and wrong weren't negotiable, they were risking everything to help him, to help people who'd been dead for 2 decades. It reminded him that there was still good in the world, still people willing to stand up for what mattered. "All right," he said. "Let's find the truth that Tom Briggs buried." They worked through the day with quiet purpose. Ada went to the church and returned with 3 dusty boxes of telegraph records, while Hewitt closed his store and brought over the land office documents he'd been collecting for years, copies of claims, deed transfers, anything related to mining operations in the territory from 1875 to 1880. They spread everything across Ada's dining room table like pieces of a vast puzzle. Boone worked through the telegraph records, reading message after message, most of them mundane business transactions or personal communications. Hewitt examined the land office documents, his practiced eyes scanning dates and signatures. Ada made coffee and brought food, but mostly she watched, occasionally pointing out a name she recognized or a date that seemed significant. It was late afternoon when Boone found it. A telegram, dated March 3, 1876, sent from Cold Creek to the Nevada Territory Mining Office. The message was brief. "Claim filed for J.B. Hartwell stop. Rich strike Devil's Canyon stop request. Expedited processing stop." It was signed T. Briggs. Devil's Canyon. Not Devil's Throat. A completely different location, hundreds of miles south in Nevada. Briggs had been clever. He'd filed a claim for a real gold strike, but in a different location entirely. The Nevada authorities would have checked, found gold where he said it was, and approved the claim. Meanwhile, he'd been working the real Devil's Throat mine in Montana, extracting gold that legally belonged to 5 dead men. "Look at this," Hewitt said, his voice tight with excitement. He pushed a document across the table, a land office record from 1877. Joshua Briggs Hartwell filed a claim transfer in Nevada, selling the Devil's Canyon stake to a mining consortium for $50,000. The sale went through, everything legal and proper. But here's the thing, I sent inquiries to that consortium 10 years ago. They confirmed they bought the claim and worked it for 3 years. They pulled out maybe $20,000 worth of gold before the vein played out. 20,000 from a claim he sold for 50? Boone frowned. Why would they pay that much? Because someone convinced them it was worth more, Hewitt said. Someone showed them an assayer's report that made it look like the Devil's Canyon claim would yield 75,000 or more. The pieces clicked together in Boone's mind. The assayer's report from the lockbox. The one Marcus Whitmore did for the Fairweather claim. Briggs must have altered it, changed the location from Montana to Nevada, kept everything else the same. The consortium bought the claim based on false information, and when it didn't pan out, they just figured they'd been wrong about the vein, Ada said slowly. They never knew they'd been looking at a report for a completely different mine. Boone stood and paced to the window, his mind racing. So Briggs files a real claim in Nevada, shows up with an altered assayer's report that makes it look incredibly valuable, sells it for $50,000. That gives him a fortune and a legitimate story for where his wealth came from. Meanwhile, he's been quietly extracting gold from Devil's Throat, selling it through other channels, building even more wealth. Nobody questions it because he's already supposedly rich from the Nevada claim. It's brilliant, Hewitt admitted grudgingly. Horrible, but brilliant. He created an entire false history for himself. We need the original assayer's report, Boone said. The one from the lockbox shows Devil's Throat in Montana. If we can prove he altered it to say Devil's Canyon in Nevada, we can show he committed fraud on top of murder. There's another copy, Ada said suddenly. Marcus Whitmore, the assayer, he would have kept his own records. He always kept duplicates of everything in case there were disputes later. He's in Helena now, Hewitt reminded them. That's 3 days' ride, then I'll go. Boone turned from the window. If Whitmore still has those records, if he kept a copy of the original report, he did. They all turned. The voice had come from the doorway, where a man Boone didn't recognize stood watching them. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years working outdoors. But it was his eyes that caught Boone's attention, clear, intelligent, and full of pain. Marcus Whitmore, the man said, stepping into the room. I got word from my daughter that someone was asking about old assayers' reports. Took the train from Helena as soon as I heard. Ada moved forward. Marcus, we didn't know you were coming. Didn't want to wait. Whitmore's gaze settled on Boone. You're the one who bought the Fairweather cabin. The one asking questions about Tom Briggs. I am. Then you should know. I've been carrying a weight for 20 years. A weight I'm finally ready to put down. Whitmore reached into his coat and pulled out a leather portfolio, weathered but intact. This is my copy of every assay I did in 1875, including the one for the Fairweather claim. Boone took the portfolio with hands that trembled slightly. Inside were a dozen documents, all meticulously preserved. He found the Fairweather report quickly. It was identical to the one in the lockbox, down to the last detail. Except for one crucial difference. This one had Marcus Whitmore's official seal at the bottom, and it clearly stated the location as Devil's Throat, Bitterroot Mountains. Montana Territory. Briggs came to me in early 1876, Whitmore said quietly, sitting down at the table. Showed me a copy of this report, or what I thought was a copy. Said he needed it for investors. I didn't think anything of it at the time. The miners were dead. The claim was technically abandoned. If someone wanted to buy it up and work it, that seemed reasonable enough. You didn't know what he was planning, Ada said gently. No, but I should have suspected. A few months later, I heard about his big Nevada strike, about the fortune he'd made. I was happy for him. Thought he'd earned some good luck after losing his partners. It wasn't until years later, when I was going through my old records, that I noticed the discrepancy. Whitmore's voice grew strained. The report he'd shown me, the one he said was for investors, it had been altered, changed from Montana to Nevada. He'd used my work, my reputation to defraud people, and by then he was sheriff, powerful, connected. I convinced myself it was just a misunderstanding, that maybe I'd made a mistake in my records. You knew, Boone said, not accusingly but simply stating the fact. I suspected, but I had no proof and I was afraid. Afraid of what Briggs might do if I accused him. Afraid that I'd end up like those miners. Whitmore looked at each of them in turn. I've lived with that fear, that guilt for 2 decades. But if you're finally going to bring him to justice, then you'll need this. He pulled out another document from the portfolio. A letter, dated April 1876, on Nevada Mining Office letterhead. It was addressed to T. Briggs, thanking him for filing the claim for J.B. Hartwell, and noting that they'd received his assayer's report showing the rich strike at Devil's Canyon. I kept this too, Whitmore said, because part of me always knew I'd need it someday, that the truth would have to come out. Boone spread all the documents across the table, the original assayer's report from Whitmore, the altered version referenced in the Nevada letter, the telegram, the land office records. Together, they told a complete story of fraud and murder. "This is it," Hewitt breathed. "This proves everything." "Almost everything," Boone corrected. "It proves fraud. It proves Briggs lied about his Nevada claim and used a false identity. But we still need to prove he murdered those men." "The bodies," Ada said. "You said you found them in the mine." "The cut support beams." "Yes, but that's on my word alone. A jury might believe me, but Briggs will claim I staged it or that I'm lying. We need something more definitive." Whitmore was quiet for a moment, then spoke. "There was a sixth document. Something Fairweather asked me to hold for him back in November of 1875. He came to town alone, said he was worried about what might happen, asked me to keep a sealed letter in my safe, told me only to open it if something happened to him and his crew." The room went absolutely silent. "You have this letter?" Boone asked carefully. "I have it. Never opened it like he asked. But I brought it with me." Whitmore reached into his coat again and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "After he disappeared, I couldn't bring myself to open it. I told myself maybe he'd turn up, maybe they all would. But they never did, and eventually opening it seemed like admitting they were really gone." Boone took the envelope. His name was written on the front in the same precise handwriting from the journal, "To whoever finds the truth, Thomas Fairweather." With Ada, Hewitt, and Whitmore watching, Boone broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The words were written in haste, but clearly. "If you are reading this, it means I am dead, and likely my crew with me. The man responsible is Thomas Briggs, who came to us under false pretenses. He has been planning to take our claim from the beginning. I have evidence of his communications with someone in the land office, evidence of his true identity. He is not who he says he is. The gold we found is cursed by the greed of one man. I do not know how he will do it, but I know he will kill us to take what is ours. If I am proven right, I pray someone will bring him to justice. And I pray my daughter will know that her father died fighting for what was right. Signed this day, November 20th, 1875, Thomas Fairweather." Boone looked up from the letter to find tears streaming down Ada's face. Whitmore sat with his head in his hands, and Hewitt had turned away, his shoulders shaking. "He knew," Ada whispered. "He knew what was coming, and he tried to leave a record. And we all failed him." "Not anymore," Boone said firmly. "Now we have everything we need. Now we bring Tom Briggs down." They spent that evening making copies of everything. Ada's neat handwriting transcribed the letter, the assayer's reports, every piece of evidence they'd gathered. Hewitt went to the telegraph office, not the one Briggs might be monitoring, but one the next town over, and sent 3 messages, one to the territorial marshal in Helena, one to a newspaper editor Hewitt trusted, and one to a lawyer in Butte who'd helped him with business matters before. "We need multiple people to know," Hewitt explained. "If something happens to us, the truth still gets out." Boone didn't argue. They were playing a dangerous game now, and Briggs would be desperate once he realized what they'd found. Desperate men did desperate things. It was Whitmore who suggested searching the church basement more thoroughly. Bill Crenshaw kept everything. If the families of those miners wrote letters here asking about their loved ones, he might have copies. They went after dark, Ada leading them through the church's side entrance with a key. The basement was cold and musty, packed with boxes and old furniture and the accumulated debris of 20 years. But there, in a corner marked Telegraph Office, 1875-1880, they found what they were looking for, a tin box, about the size of a bread box, with personal correspondence written on the lid in faded ink. Inside were letters, dozens of them, bundled together with string organized by date. Ada opened the first bundle with trembling hands. The top letter was dated May 1876, addressed to Thomas Fairweather, Cold Creek, Montana Territory, and marked "Return to Sender, addressee unknown." She read aloud, "Dear Father, I hope this letter finds you well. It has been 6 months since I've heard from you, and I am growing worried. Mother says you are probably just busy with your claim and will write when you can, but I cannot shake this feeling that something is wrong. Please, please write to me. Let me know you are safe. Your loving daughter, Elizabeth. Her voice broke on the last words. Boone took the letter gently and looked at the others in the bundle. There were 5 more from Elizabeth Fairweather, each one more desperate than the last. The final one was dated January 1877, almost 2 years after her father's death. I am coming to Cold Creek myself. I can no longer bear not knowing. Whatever has happened, I deserve to know the truth. I will arrive on the spring stage. Please, if anyone sees this, if anyone knows anything about my father, Thomas Fairweather, I beg you to tell me. Elizabeth. Did she come? Boone asked Ada. I remember her, Ada said softly. Young woman, couldn't have been more than 19. She stayed at my boarding house for a week, asking everyone about her father. The sheriff, Tom Briggs, he told her the same story he'd told everyone else. Storm, probably dead, the mountain had taken them. She left crying. I never saw her again. Boone felt anger building in his chest, hot and righteous. Briggs had looked that young woman in the eye and lied to her about murdering her father. Had watched her grieve and done nothing. Had probably been relieved when she left town. The other bundles held similar letters. Red McAllister's wife writing from Colorado begging for news. Samuel Chen's brother all the way from San Francisco offering a reward for information. Victor Hartwell's parents from Philadelphia, their messages growing shorter and more hopeless with each passing month until finally they stopped altogether. These families never got closure, Hewitt said, his voice rough with emotion. They spent years not knowing, hoping, grieving. And Briggs knew. He knew exactly what happened, and he let them suffer. We need to find them, Boone said firmly. Or their children, their relatives. They deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know their loved ones didn't abandon them, didn't disappear into the wilderness. They were murdered. Whitmore had been quiet, examining the letters with a scholar's attention to detail. Elizabeth Fairweather, married, according to the last return address on these letters, became Elizabeth Garrett, living in Chicago. If she's still alive, she'd be in her late 30s now. We'll find her, Ada promised. All of them. Once this is over, we'll make sure every family knows. They took the tin of letters back to Ada's boarding house, adding it to the growing pile of evidence. The story was complete now, not just the crime itself, but the aftermath, the pain Briggs had caused, the lives he'd shattered beyond just the 5 he'd taken. The territorial marshal will be here in 3 days, Hewitt said, checking his pocket watch. 4 at most. We need to keep this quiet until then. Keep Briggs from knowing what we've found. He already suspects, Boone pointed out. He threatened me, warned me to leave the past alone. He knows I'm looking into this, but he doesn't know we have proof. He doesn't know about Whitmore or the letters or any of it. Ada looked at each of them seriously. We need to act normal. Go about our business as if nothing has changed. Can you do that, Marcus? Whitmore nodded. I'll stay here at your boarding house if you'll have me. Tell people I'm just visiting, checking on some old business. And I'll keep the store open as usual, Hewitt added. If Briggs comes by, I'll treat him like I always do. What about me? Boone asked. They all looked at him. Finally, Ada spoke. You should stay here too, in town. If you go back up to that cabin, Briggs might decide you're too isolated, too vulnerable. Down here, with witnesses around, he'll have to be careful. Boone didn't like the idea of hiding, but he recognized the wisdom in it. All right, but I keep my rifle close. The next 2 days passed in tense normalcy. Boone stayed at the boarding house, spending his time organizing the evidence, writing detailed accounts of everything he'd found. Hewitt ran his store, and Ada maintained her routines, but they all felt the weight of what was coming. Briggs appeared once, stopping by Hewitt's store to buy ammunition. The storekeeper served him with the same professional courtesy he showed all customers, but his hands shook slightly as he counted out the cartridges. If Briggs noticed, he didn't comment. He left with a polite nod and a warning that a storm was coming. Did you see his eyes? Hewitt asked Boone later. He's suspicious. Knows something is happening. Let him be suspicious, Boone said. In 2 days it won't matter, but on the evening of the second day, Everything changed. Boone was in his room at the boarding house, reading through Fairweather's journal again, when he heard shouting from downstairs. He grabbed his rifle and rushed down to find Ada standing in the parlor, her face pale, a telegram in her hand. "The marshal," she said, her voice shaking. "He's been delayed. Flash flood washed out the railroad bridge east of Helena. He can't get here for at least a week, maybe more." "Damn," Hewitt breathed. He'd come running at the sound of the commotion. "A week? Can we keep this quiet for a whole week?" "We don't have a choice," Whitmore said, but he looked worried. "We just have to be careful." The sound of breaking glass interrupted him. Something had been thrown through the front window of the boarding house. Boone moved to it carefully, keeping low, and picked up what turned out to be a rock with paper wrapped around it. He unfolded the paper and read the message scrawled in crude letters: "Leave town by morning or burn." Ada's hands went to her mouth. "He knows. Tom knows we're planning something." "How?" Hewitt demanded. "We've been so careful." "The telegraph," Whitmore said suddenly. "Of course. Bill Crenshaw is dead, but his replacement would have logged our messages. Briggs is sheriff. He'd have access to those logs. He might not know exactly what we have, but he knows we contacted the marshal, knows we're building a case against him." Boone looked out the broken window into the darkness. Somewhere out there, Tom Briggs was watching, waiting, planning his next move. The sheriff couldn't let them live to testify. Not now. Not with the marshal coming, with the evidence piling up, with 20 years of secrets about to be dragged into the light. "We need to move the evidence," Boone said decisively. "Spread it out, hide it in different places. If he burns this building or comes after us, we can't lose everything we've gathered." They worked quickly, dividing the documents into 4 separate packages. Ada took one to hide in the church, in a place only she knew. Hewitt took another to his store, concealing it in a false bottom he'd built years ago for his most valuable merchandise. Whitmore kept a third, tucking it inside his coat with instructions to run if trouble started. And Boone kept the 4th, along with the original journal and the photograph. "If something happens," Boone said, making sure they all heard him, "if Briggs comes for us, you scatter. Get the evidence out of town however you can. The marshal will come eventually. Make sure he gets the truth." "And what will you do?" Ada asked. Boone checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. "I'm going to end this, tonight, before Briggs can hurt anyone else." "You can't face him alone," Hewitt protested. "He'll kill you. He's going to try to kill all of us anyway," Boone interrupted. "At least this way I choose the time and place. I'll go back to the cabin. He'll follow. He can't resist the chance to catch me isolated. And this time I'll be ready for him. This is suicide," Whitmore said flatly. "Maybe, or maybe it's justice." Boone looked at the evidence in his hands, thinking about Thomas Fairweather writing those final words in his journal, about 5 men dying in darkness, about Elizabeth Fairweather crying in Ada's boarding house. Those miners deserve better than to be forgotten, better than to have their murderer walk free. If I have to face Briggs alone to make that right, then that's what I'll do." Ada stepped forward and put her hand on his arm. "Be careful, Elias. Tom Briggs has been killing to protect his secret for 20 years. He won't stop now." "I know," Boone said softly. "But neither will I." He left by the back door, moving through the darkness toward the edge of town, where his horse was stabled. Behind him, Cold Creek lay quiet under the stars, unaware that its long sleep of lies was about to end. One way or another, by morning, the truth would be known. The cabin was dark when Boone arrived, just as he'd left it. He didn't light the lamp. Instead, he moved through the familiar space and darkness, preparing his trap with the careful precision of a man who knew this might be his last night alive. He'd been a hunter long enough to know how predators thought. Briggs would come, probably with his deputies, and he'd expect to find Boone asleep or unprepared. The sheriff would want this to look like an accident, a tragic fire maybe, or a confrontation with a dangerous drifter that had gone wrong. Anything that would let him maintain his story, protect his position, but Boone wasn't planning to give him that chance. He positioned his rifle within easy reach near the window, giving him a clear line of sight to the approach. He built up the fire so it would cast shadows on the walls, making it look like someone was moving around inside. Then he settled into the darkness near the door, his back against the wall, and waited. The night was quiet, except for the wind in the trees and the occasional crack of settling wood. Boone's thoughts drifted to Martha, to the life they'd shared before the fever took her. She'd been a practical woman, quick to laugh but slow to judge. What would she think of him now, sitting in a dead man's cabin, preparing to face a killer? She'd understand, he thought. Martha had always understood the difference between revenge and justice. It was past midnight when he heard them. Horses, moving slowly up the trail, trying to be quiet. 2 of them, maybe 3. Boone tensed, his hand moving to the rifle. Through the window he saw shapes moving in the darkness. 2 men on horseback, both dismounting at the edge of the clearing. In the faint starlight, he recognized Sheriff Tom Briggs and his young deputy, the same one who'd ridden up with him days earlier. They tied their horses and approached on foot, Briggs in the lead. The sheriff had his gun drawn, held low and ready. The deputy looked nervous, kept glancing at Briggs as if uncertain about what they were doing here in the middle of the night. "Boone!" Briggs called out when they were 20 feet from the cabin. "We need to talk." "I know you're in there." Boone stayed silent, watching. "Listen to me," Briggs continued, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he'd perfected over years of wearing a badge. "I know what you think you found up here. I know you've been talking to people stirring up trouble, but you don't understand the full story. Let me explain before you do something you'll regret." Still, Boone said nothing. He watched the deputy drift to the left, trying to get an angle on the door. Smart tactics, but predictable. Briggs took another step closer. The firelight from inside played across his face, showing the hard lines around his mouth, the calculation in his eyes. "The truth is complicated, Boone. Yes, I was with those miners. Yes, things went wrong. But it wasn't murder, it was an accident. The mine collapsed. I barely escaped with my life. Everything I did after, claiming that gold, building my life here, I did, because those men would have wanted their sacrifice to mean something. I built schools, churches, helped people. That has to count for something, does it?" Boone finally spoke, his voice coming from the darkness near the door. Both men jumped slightly at the sound. "Does it count for Elizabeth Fairweather, who spent years not knowing what happened to her father? Does it count for the wives and parents who never got their loved ones back? You didn't just kill 5 men, Briggs. You killed their family's peace of mind. You killed the truth." Briggs' expression hardened. "The past is past. Nothing we do now will bring those men back. But we can still protect what's been built here. Walk away, Boone. Take some money, buy yourself a new start somewhere else. Nobody needs to know about any of this." "You mean nobody needs to know you're a murderer?" Briggs said, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. "That you're alone on a mountain in the middle of the night, and accidents happen." He raised his gun, but Boone had expected that. He kicked the door open hard, the sudden movement and noise breaking Briggs' concentration for just a second. In that second, Boone dove low and to the side. Coming up with his rifle already shouldered, the deputy fired first, panicked, his shot going wide. Boone didn't return fire. The young man was just following orders, didn't understand what he'd gotten himself into. But Briggs was already moving, dropping behind a pile of firewood, returning fire with the cold precision of someone who'd killed before. Bullets tore through the cabin's walls, sending splinters flying. Boone rolled behind the overturned table, feeling the solid impact of lead hitting wood inches from his head. The air filled with gunsmoke and the sharp crack of rifles. "Stand down, deputy," Boone shouted during a lull in the firing. "This isn't your fight. Your sheriff is a murderer, and I can prove it." "Don't listen to him," Briggs ordered. "He's a madman, came here planning to kill us both. Shoot him!" But the deputy hesitated, and in that hesitation, Boone saw his chance. He broke from cover, charging across the cabin toward the door, firing as he moved. Briggs rose to meet him, and they collided hard, both men going down in a tangle of limbs and fury. The rifle skittered away. Briggs was on top, his hands going for Boone's throat, his face twisted with rage. "You should have taken the money," he snarled. "Should have walked away." Boone brought his knee up hard into Briggs' stomach, breaking his grip. They rolled, crashed into the wall. fought with the desperate intensity of men who knew only one of them was walking away from this. Boone's hand found Briggs's coat, pulled, and felt the sheriff's badge tear free, the pin ripping through fabric. He threw it across the room, watching it skitter into the darkness. "You're not fit to wear that." Briggs lunged again. But this time, Boone was ready. Boone caught Briggs' wrist as the sheriff's fist came down, twisted hard, and used the man's momentum to slam him into the fireplace. Briggs cried out as his shoulder hit stone, but he didn't stop fighting. He was younger, stronger, had 20 years of easy living behind him, while Boone had 20 years of hard mountain winters. But Boone had something Briggs didn't, righteous anger, and the faces of 5 dead men watching from the darkness. They crashed through the cabin, destroying what little furniture remained. The deputy stood frozen in the doorway, his gun forgotten, watching his sheriff fight like a cornered animal. Watching the man he'd respected, maybe even admired, reveal himself as something brutal and desperate. "Tell him," Boone gasped, pinning Briggs against the wall. "Tell your deputy what you did. Tell him about the miners you murdered." "Go to hell!" Briggs spat, bringing his head forward in a vicious headbutt. Stars exploded across Boone's vision. He staggered back, and Briggs reached for a piece of broken chair, swinging it like a club. The wood caught Boone across the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. He went down hard, and Briggs was on him again, hands finding his throat, squeezing with murderous intent. Boone's vision began to darken at the edges. His hands scrabbled across the floor, searching for anything, finding paper. The letter. It had fallen from his coat during the struggle. With his last strength, Boone pulled it free and thrust it toward the deputy. "Read it," he choked out. "Read what Fairweather wrote before Briggs killed him." The deputy moved forward, picked up the yellowed paper, and began to read aloud in a voice that shook. "If you are reading this, it means I am dead, and likely my crew with me. The man responsible is Thomas Briggs." "Stop!" Briggs released Boone's throat, lunging toward the deputy. "Give me that." But the young man stepped back, continuing to read, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He has been planning to take our claim from the beginning. I have evidence of his communications with someone in the land office, evidence of his true identity. He's not who he says he is. It's lies," Briggs shouted. "Lies written by a madman who was losing his mind from isolation. You can't believe the gold we found is cursed," the deputy continued, tears streaming down his face now as the truth of what he was reading sank in. "Cursed by the greed of one man. I do not know how he will do it, but I know he will kill us to take what is ours. If I am proven right, I pray someone will bring him to justice." Briggs made a sound like a wounded animal and rushed the deputy, but Boone tackled him from behind, bringing him down hard. They rolled together, but Boone was on top now, his weight pinning Briggs to the floor. "It's over," Boone said, breathing hard. "Your deputy knows. The territorial marshal is coming. I sent copies of everything, the journal, the assayer's reports, the letters from the families. Even if you kill me tonight, the truth is already out." Briggs stopped struggling. His face crumpled. 20 years of carefully maintained lies falling away to reveal the frightened young man he'd once been. "I didn't mean for it to happen that way," he whispered. "I just wanted my share. Just wanted what I'd earned." "You earned nothing," Boone said quietly. "You stole it from better men than you'll ever be." The deputy had his gun out now, pointed at both of them, but his hands shaking so badly, Boone wondered if he could hit anything. "Sheriff Briggs, sir, I need you to stand up slowly. I need you to put your hands where I can see them." "Don't do this, boy," Briggs said, his voice taking on that authoritative tone again. "I'm your sheriff. I'm the law here. This man is a criminal, can't you see? He's trying to—" "No," the deputy interrupted, his voice firm despite his tears. "No, sir. I heard the letter. I heard him, and I've been your deputy long enough to know when a man is lying. Please, sir, don't make this harder than it already is." Briggs looked at the deputy, at Boone, at the cabin that held the evidence of his crimes. Something broke in his face then. He wasn't the powerful sheriff anymore, wasn't the respected pillar of the community. He was just an old man who'd murdered for gold and spent 20 years looking over his shoulder. "They were going to cheat me," he said softly. Wanted to divide it equally, even though I'd done twice the work. It wasn't fair. It wasn't, you killed 5 men because you didn't want to share, Boone said, pulling himself to his feet. That's all this ever was. Greed, simple, ugly greed. Footsteps outside announced more arrivals. Samuel Hewitt burst through the door, followed by Ada Morrison and Marcus Whitmore, all of them armed, all of them ready to help. They stopped when they saw the scene. Briggs on the floor, the deputy covering him, Boone bleeding but alive. The marshal's train just arrived, Hewitt said, breathing hard from the climb. He's on his way up here now. We came as fast as we could. Boone nodded, suddenly exhausted. He picked up Briggs' badge from where it had fallen, dented and scratched from being thrown across the room. He looked at it for a moment, thinking about what it was supposed to represent. Justice, protection, service. Then he handed it to the deputy. You're going to need to arrest your sheriff, Boone said gently. Can you do that? The young man straightened, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Yes, sir, I can do that. As the deputy read Briggs his rights, as Ada moved to tend to Boone's wounds, as Whitmore and Hewitt secured the prisoner, Elias Boone walked to the window and looked out at the mountain. Somewhere up there, in Devil's Throat Mine, 5 men had been waiting 20 years for this moment. For justice, for truth. It's done, he whispered to the darkness. You can rest now. 3 months later, spring came to the Bitterroot Mountains. The snow melted away in patches, revealing new grass and wildflowers, and the creek behind the cabin ran high and cold with snowmelt. Boone stood on the porch he'd built, watching the morning sun paint the peaks gold, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The trial had been swift. Tom Briggs, faced with the overwhelming evidence and his own deputy's testimony, had confessed to everything. The murders, the fraud, the 20 years of lies. The territorial judge had sentenced him to hang, but Briggs had died in his cell before the sentence could be carried out. Heart failure, the doctor said, though Boone suspected it was something else. The weight of guilt, maybe, finally crushing the life out of a man who'd spent 2 decades running from it. The town of Cold Creek had reeled from the revelation. Some people refused to believe it, insisted it was all a mistake, that Briggs had been framed. But most had accepted the truth with a kind of sad resignation. The school and church Briggs had funded remained. The children needed education, and the faithful needed a place to worship. But his name was removed from everything. The plaques came down, the dedications were chiseled away, and slowly, Cold Creek began to rebuild its identity on something other than blood money. Samuel Hewitt had been elected the new sheriff. He wore the badge with the same quiet competence he'd shown running his store, and he'd cleaned out the corruption that Briggs had let fester. The young deputy who'd helped arrest Briggs stayed on, learning from Hewitt, trying to be the kind of lawman his old boss should have been. Ada Morrison had taken it upon herself to contact the families. She'd found Elizabeth Fairweather Garrett in Chicago, now a mother of 3, and had written her a long letter explaining everything. The response had come 2 weeks later. Elizabeth was coming west for the first time since that heartbreaking visit 21 years ago. She wanted to see where her father had lived, where he'd died, and to finally lay him to rest properly. The other families had been harder to track down. Red McAllister's wife had remarried and moved to California. Samuel Chen's brother had passed away, but his nephew had traveled from San Francisco. Victor Hartwell's parents were both dead, but he had a sister who came from Philadelphia. And John McAllister had a son who'd never known his father. Now grown with children of his own, they all came for the ceremony. The bodies had been recovered from Devil's Throat Mine, treated with the respect they deserved, and brought down to Cold Creek. The town had voted to bury them in the cemetery, and to erect proper headstones with their names and the truth of how they died. Boone stood at the back of the gathered crowd, watching as the minister spoke words of comfort and loss. Elizabeth Fairweather Garrett stood at her father's grave, her hand resting on the headstone that read, Thomas Fairweather, 1838-1876, a good man, a loving father, murdered for gold but remembered for his life. When the ceremony ended, Elizabeth approached Boone. She was a handsome woman in her late 30s, with her father's thoughtful eyes and strong jaw. "Mr. Boone, I wanted to thank you for not giving up, for finding the truth when everyone else had stopped looking. Your father left a trail," Boone said quietly. "He made sure someone would find it eventually. I just happened to be the one stubborn enough to follow it. Still, you gave me what I've needed for 21 years. Answers. Closure." She smiled, though tears gleamed in her eyes. "I can stop wondering now. Stop imagining. I know what happened to him, and I know he didn't abandon me. That's a gift I can never repay." After she left to join her family, Ada Morrison approached. She'd organized the whole ceremony, had made sure everything was done right, that the families were taken care of. "You've been quiet today," she observed, thinking, Boone admitted, about how much pain one man's greed caused. All those years, all that suffering, just because Briggs couldn't share. But it's over now. Justice was done, was it? Boone looked at the headstones. Briggs is dead. Those men are still dead. Their families still lost 20 years they'll never get back. I'm not sure justice is ever really done in cases like this. The best we can do is make sure the truth is known, that the victims are remembered." Ada was quiet for a moment, then took his arm gently. "You did more than that, Elias. You gave those families peace. You gave this town a chance to build something honest. And you found your purpose, the thing you were looking for when you bought that cabin." Boone thought about that as the crowd dispersed, as families gathered around the graves to say private goodbyes, as Cold Creek began the process of healing. She was right. He'd come to the mountain looking for solitude, for a place to hide from his grief and his memories of Martha. Instead, he'd found a mystery, and in solving it he'd found himself again. The cabin was his now, truly his. He'd repaired it properly, made it solid and warm and comfortable. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof, but it was home. And somehow, knowing what had happened here, knowing he'd brought justice to the men who'd died here, made it feel less haunted. The ghosts had moved on, and maybe so had he. Samuel Hewitt had offered him a job as deputy, but Boone had declined. He wasn't a lawman, but he'd agreed to help out when needed, to use his tracking skills and mountain knowledge to assist the sheriff's office. It was good work, honest work, and it gave him a reason to come down from the mountain regularly, which meant seeing Ada more often. They'd become close during the investigation, bonded by shared purpose and danger. Now, with the crisis past, they were discovering they simply enjoyed each other's company. Where it would lead, Boone didn't know. But for the first time in 3 years, he was open to the possibility of something beyond grief. He visited the cemetery one last time before heading back up the mountain. The 5 headstones stood in a row, clean and white in the spring sunshine, their names carved deep so they'd last for generations. Thomas Fairweather, John Red McAllister, Samuel Chen, Victor Hartwell, and the 5th marker. Added at Boone's insistence, "To the unknown miners of the West, may they all find justice and peace." "Rest easy," Boone said softly, touching each stone in turn. "Your story's been told. You won't be forgotten." As he rode back up to the cabin, with the spring breeze warm on his face and the mountains solid and eternal around him, Elias Boone reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. He'd bought a rotting cabin on a whim, had found a journal that changed everything, and had pursued justice for men he'd never known. The town had called him mad for buying the place. Maybe they'd been right, but sometimes madness and wisdom looked alike from the outside. Sometimes the foolish choice was actually the bravest one. And sometimes, when a man thought he was running away from his life, he was actually running toward the purpose he'd been searching for all along. The cabin came into view, solid and welcoming against the mountainside. Smoke would soon rise from its chimney again. Coffee would brew in the morning light, and the journals Boone had started keeping would add another chapter. Not about murder or gold or 20-year-old crimes, but about rebuilding, about second chances, about finding meaning in unexpected places. The locals had laughed when he bought the cursed cabin. They'd shaken their heads and called him a fool. But as Boone dismounted and stood looking at his home, at the mountains that had kept their secrets for 2 decades until he'd come along to uncover them, He smiled. Let them laugh. He'd found what he came for, justice for the dead, peace for the living, and a reason to keep going when he'd thought he had none left. Sometimes the places we're drawn to hold answers we didn't know we were searching for. Sometimes a man has to leave everything behind to find what truly matters. And sometimes, in a rotting cabin on a forgotten mountain, surrounded by the ghosts of better men, we finally discover who we were meant to be all along.